So these are the two visual, empirical notion of Asia being articulated into two bloody wars. Now, this war usually makes us remember more about these things and about the notion of unity. In fact, the pan-Asianism created by these two wars is quite incredible. So what do you think, in a sense, this idea of Asia in modern history? Of course, there are the anti-colonial notion of Asia, and the whole subaltern history has been about, in some sense, about this. But I'm looking at how wars actually form histories of the world rather than ocean or whatever. Because now, in the era of drones, where you can be hunted in some cave somewhere, where is the boundary? Yeah? So, what is the idea of the world? The idea of Asia probably is non-existent in the wars of drones conducted by people in Michigan who attacked in the middle of Taliban somewhere in Afghanistan. So, can you give me some response to that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those were very insightful comments. And yes, of course, you know, Asia as a geographical space had been defined in Europe, you know, maybe around 1870 by the various geographical societies there, those who worked in it. But what I was trying to suggest was that that definition was not accepted uncritically by the peoples of Asia. And there were constant redefinitions that were going on, which need to be studied. Even though I have written myself in the past on oceanic connections, the Indian Ocean as a large Mediterranean, if you will, I was trying to suggest that there are certain overlaps between a conceptualization of Asia transcending national frontiers and the Indian Ocean as a space, which also you know, spills over various colonial or national boundaries. The point that you make about wars is a very important and poignant one. But I think that the two wars that you mention are of different orders. It is true that Japan's victory over Russia in the 1904-1905 war sent a thrill across Asia, right through Southeast Asia, South Asia, all the way up to West Asia. But that, I think, had something to do with the fact that much of this part of the world was under Western colonial rule at that time, and it was a morale booster, if you will, that an Asian power could stand up to the West. It was much more symbolic rather than the actual fact that a bloody war was being fought in Northeast Asia. The second war that you talk about is in fact much more problematic in trying to evoke the question of an Asian universalism. And I was trying to allude to this problem. Now, even though in today's lecture I spoke mostly about the first half of the 20th century, my lecture can be interpreted or read or heard as an allegory for the present, the early part of the 21st century. And that is why the distinction that I was drawing between imperialism and universalism, or even a universalist boast, which I was being somewhat critical of, and the universalist aspiration, which is more generous and accommodating, that I was appreciating, is in fact quite important. What I was in fact suggesting was that even though there were many of these noble visions of Asian unity and Asian universalism, unfortunately, there was a terrible nationalistic war that broke out between the two major Asian powers, China and Japan. And while Tagore was criticizing Europe during the First World War, pointing to Europe to say that, look, this is what nationalism does. You know, the carnage that took place in Germany and France, and in fact all over Europe. What 1937 showed was that Asia was equally prone to this European tendency. But of course, just look at European history. The two world wars were primarily, though not exclusively, European wars. And yet, by now, the European idea is being revived. Those who had been bitter enemies are now within sort of a common continental framework of politics and economics and so on. Similarly, I think, now that Asia is, as I said, recovering the position it had lost in the late 18th century, there is much to be gained through a more pursuit of a more generous spirit of an Asian universalism. But I was also trying to suggest that there may be pitfalls on the way. And if there's any lesson to be drawn out of the story that I have told today, is that let not the search for some kind of an Asian universalism and an Asian unity be sidetracked and undermined by the kinds of nationalistic wars that destroyed that spirit of Asian universalism in the 1930s and 1940s.
I didn't see which hand came up first. I'm so sorry.
Maybe she's saying from the student lab. Professor Bose, your lecture this afternoon on the idea of Asia in modern history, mediated through, articulated through primarily to internationalism or universalism, was a fascinating development of the idea of, that is, the conception of Asia in modern history. I thought perhaps you might make some comment this afternoon on, with permission, adapting your title as well, not the idea or conception of Asia in modern history, but the idea, the insight of Asia in ancient history to the major religions, because all the major scriptures are Asian, and embedded within Christianity, within Buddhism, within Islam, which you mentioned, are ideas of universalism. Of course, in the case of Christianity, that idea has been overwritten by European conceptualization of it, so that in the popular imagination, Christianity came with the Portuguese, but of course it came through St. Thomas to the coasts of India. I wonder what your thoughts are on that issue.
Yes, I think you make a very important point, and I have actually written elsewhere about how to locate the place of religion in the pursuit of universalism in modern times. Sometimes, internationalism in the modern period is seen to be of a secular assortment. For example, a colleague of mine has recently written a book on the Wilsonian moment around 1918-19, and how Wilsonian internationalism was used by anti-colonial nationalists in demanding self-determination and so forth. But even though it's a wonderful book by a younger colleague of mine, Eres Manella, it completely neglects to look at the other internationalisms or universalisms which may have been more important precisely in that particular period. Now, one of them, of course, was Bolshevik internationalism. Just after the 1917 revolution, you may or may not wish to see it as religious. Depends on whether you want to regard communism as a religion or not. But far more important than either Wilsonian internationalism or Bolshevik internationalism, exactly in that period, 1919 to about 22, was an Islamic universalism, which in fact Gandhi embraced in his first, all India mass movement. And so I think even in modern history, the religious tinge to universalism, particularly of, in anti-colonial movements, ought not to be minimized. But of course, there's also an ancient history of a certain universalist spirit being carried by the major world religions that you mentioned. And I think that we need to study this much more carefully. And in many ways, the rigid area studies rubric had prevented us from actually being able to study religiously informed universalisms in the ancient, medieval, and modern periods as seriously as we should. So, for example, in the North American Academy, from about the from the end of the Second World War to the 1980s, South Asia was seen to be separate from Southeast Asia, from East Asia, from West Asia, or the Middle East. And yet, how can you study Buddhism or Buddhist universalism without actually looking into the comparisons and connections between South and East Asia, South and Southeast Asia? How can you study Islam and Islamic universalism without exploring the comparisons and connections between South Asia and the Middle East, but also Southeast Asia, the Malay Peninsula, Indonesia, the southern part of the Philippines? And Christianity, it's not a colonial import into India. It goes back at least to the 4th century, to the Kerala coast and so on. It is as much an Indian religion as Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and so on, Sikhism, and so forth. So I think it's important to study both how a universalist spirit is carried by these religions across many political and other kinds of borders. But at the same time, it's equally important to study how particular regions creatively appropriate, adapt what comes in from outside. And what is quite fascinating is that even if you look at Hinduism, since I was talking about Tagore, there were some in India in this period, I have to tell you, who were very arrogant, who thought that India had made a gift of culture and civilization to Southeast Asia. They are the ones whom I regard as making the universalist boasts. They are not the ones with the universalist aspirations. But Tagore and some of his close collaborators were quite clear that if you look at the great Indian epics, let us say the Ramayana, the versions that have been created in Southeast Asia, whether in Java or in Thailand, were equally important, innovative, creative efforts as the many versions of that epic in India. So we have to recognize how particular religions might emanate out of a particular region. But and that is important to study how it spreads. But how is it creatively molded in the regions where these ideas reach? That too is an equally important intellectual enterprise. So yes, I would entirely, support your idea that religiously informed universalisms need to be studied in more subtle and sophisticated ways than they might have been in the past. Just as I don't have any relationship with the Bose who comes from the same region as I do and now lives in the same region where I live, who has made the famous speakers. But in the interests of full disclosure, I should mention that that Subhash Chandra Bose was my father's uncle and therefore my granduncle. And my grandfather was Sharat Bose, who was also a leader of the Indian independence movement. So there is a family relationship there, but not with the painter, Nandalal Bose. Even though I had written an essay on Nandalal Bose, there was a wonderful exhibition of his paintings in the San Diego Museum of Modern Art and in the Philadelphia Museum of Art last year. And they brought out a catalogue, and I wrote a longish essay on his art, and particularly because, many of these painters are seen to be